glossed over this console in a few other videos, as it was really released in the prime of console competition and innovation. Everything on paper about the Jaguar should have sent it hurtling to stardom, but it remains a lesser known machine of the 90s. We've covered the past of Atari in previous videos along with the ST, so let's wade into this Jaguar-laden jungle beginning in 1985. Technology-wise, a hell of a year to be alive. Atari had been known as a gaming company for years, and after buying out Atari's consumer division, Jack Tramiel wasn't about to let go of that heritage. With existing Atari stock on his hands, his first job was to push out existing console stocks of the Darth Vader style 2600s and the Atari XL series, based on the original 8-bit home micros. This kept money coming in whilst they finalised and launched their new Atari ST machine. The system Atari Corporation's future depended upon. But Tramiel also recognised there was room for budget video game consoles to compete with the reignited games market, thanks in part to the Nintendo Entertainment System. In late 1985, Michael Katz was poached from Epyx to run Atari's new entertainment and electronics division. In 1986 they would relaunch the Atari 2600 as the 2600 Junior.
Oh yes, sirree, it's the 2600 from Atari.
Alongside the upgraded Atari 7800.
I want the sound that curl my hair.
What do you want? 7800s everywhere.
Somewhat aging hardware, but they ignited nostalgia amongst fans and both offered a vast array of easy to use home titles thanks to backwards compatibility. In 1987 the XE game system also launched. Based on the aging 8-bit Atari line again, this machine offered high compatibility with original software and peripherals, but was sleeker and furnished to fit in with the recently released Atari ST. It also sported some new titles such as Barnyard Blaster and Bug Hunt, along with various repackaged existing titles. Blessed with a trusted name, the initial production run of 100,000 systems was sold over the Christmas 1987 season. However, the specifications of these machines were basic, and although the range was selling reasonably well, they weren't really kitted for competing with the current systems in the console market, let alone the new hardware on the horizon.
And only Atari comes with a real joystick. Both have guns, but only Atari comes with the target game Bug Hunt.
Forward to 1989, and Jack Tramiel had retired from daily operations of Atari, and his son Sam was now in charge, although Jack still remained on the Atari board. Atari STs are still selling well, but there's still plenty of room in the advanced gaming market. This year would mark the entry of two significant machines to the Atari line designed to plug that gap. The first would be the Atari STE, an upgraded ST model featuring a blitter chip, improved graphics and enriched sound. The second would be a device pitched to them from Michael Katz's former company, Epyx. Designed by Dave Needle and RJ McCall, formerly members of the Amiga design team, along with their CEO David Morse, also from Amiga, Epyx first approached Nintendo regarding their new handheld device, called the Handy in 1987. However, Nintendo had already begun work on the Game Boy and weren't really interested. Epyx then approached Atari, with whom they already had software licensing deals in place, and were pleased to find that Jack Tramiel was very interested.
Yes.
Atari had attempted to produce their own portable machine, the Atari 2200, but were experiencing a few issues around design and implementation. Blessed with many innovative features, the system showcased by Epyx was at the cutting edge of design, poised to have a colour LCD screen and incorporate 16-bit design elements. It was agreed that Atari would manufacture and market the handheld, and Epyx would supply the games. This allowed Atari to enter the handheld market with very little work or investment. With a handheld in the bag, which would soon adopt the Lynx name, it was time to look at the console market once again.
It'll blow you away.
Given that Atari already had the basis of a games machine in their ST computer, they began work on a prototype in 1988 called the Super XE. The Super XE was conceived to be an upgrade to their XE game system, a cross between the ST but with a double-clocked Motorola 68000 CPU and a Transputer Blossom video card. This was based around a parallel microchip design by a Bristol company, Inmos. and was in effect a precursor to the multi-core processors we have today. This technology was later incorporated into the extremely rare Atari Transputer workstation. However, Atari would again look externally, this time to find a company to complete and implement their chip and circuit design. Unfortunately, Richard Miller from Atari's Texas R&D division had connections with a gent by the name of John Matheson. Over in Cambridge, England, Martin Brennan, Ben Cheese and John Matheson had established a company called Flair Technology in 1986 after the demise of their previous company, Sinclair Research. Their first business was developing a technology demonstration for Amstrad called the Flair 1. This system was intended to become a games machine with high-end audio and video capabilities, and was rumoured to share design aspects from an abandoned Sinclair model, the Loki, a ZX Spectrum-derived home computer based around a Z80 CPU but with custom sound and graphics chips designed to rival the upcoming Atari ST and Amiga machines. The Flair 1 ended up being used in some arcade cabinets, including some quiz machines produced by BULLFROG. It was also further developed for use in the Connex multi-system Slipstream prototype, and had some impressive capabilities. It could move sprites and block graphics faster than an Atari ST, with up to 256 colours, and could even handle 3D models akin to the 32-bit Acorn Archimedes. But Connex sadly experienced financial difficulties, and it was not to be. Thankfully, Atari's connections to Flair, along with their gained expertise, allowed Atari to hand over the Super XE system for completion in 1989. The same year, Michael Katz would move to Sega and push for Genesis. Flair would push the design of the Super XE, incorporating a dedicated object processor called the Panther chip, after the car owned by Martin Brennan's wife, a Panther Callista. Alongside an Ensoniq sound processor, this setup allowed a huge 8,192 on-screen colours from a palette of 262,144, and impressive sprite handling capabilities. The system would then adopt the Panther name as a whole, but Flair would also begin working on an additional project under the Flair 2 studio name, which would incorporate similar features. This system was designed to be a 64-bit powerhouse, which, with the help of their Connex multi-system work, convinced Atari would destroy the likes of the Sega Mega Drive whilst remaining cost-effective. Development of both the Panther and the new Jaguar continued, following in the naming style of ever-increasing cat sizes, with a handheld dubbed after the smaller Lynx. But by 1991 it was clear that the Jaguar was progressing far quicker than expected. Despite the Panther being pretty much ready for launch, it was cancelled so that Atari and Flair could concentrate on bringing something even more special to the market. The Atari Lynx had by now already been launched, and although initial sales were compelling, with 90% of its initial 1989 release shipment selling within a matter of days, the Nintendo Game Boy had slowed penetration. Despite the advanced Lynx hardware, battery life and low cost seemed order of the day in this fledgling market. However, the cutting-edge console market was going in the opposite direction, with consumers demanding more bits and more power.
A scientist creates the ultimate machine.
At last!
A machine that will give him the power to journey into the mega world.
Combined with this, the Atari ST and STE models weren't shipping as quickly as hoped, and Atari needed a new revenue stream. Atari would need to go all out, and with Flair working on the Jaguar, Atari themselves continued improving their ST line with their next home computer, the Atari Falcon, a machine which would borrow design aspects from the new Jaguar technology, including the incorporation of a digital signal processor and the ability to utilise some Jaguar accessories, including the joypads.
A really beautifully designed computer. Now, even though you may not have heard of the Falcon before, it's not new. It's actually been around a couple of years. It's just there hasn't really been the software available for it.
With the Sega Mega Drive gaining a global dominance based on its advanced design and reasonable cost, the Atari Jaguar felt like Atari's ticket to get back in the game. And looking at the specifications, it's not hard to see why. The console has 5 processors in 3 chips. The first is Tom, consisting of 750,000 transistors and clocked at 26.591 MHz. This 32-bit RISC architecture is responsible for the system's graphical processing. This chip also incorporates a 64-bit object processor and 64-bit blitter processor for logical operations. The system could technically handle unlimited hardware sprites, although you're always limited by processing time. The second chip, Jerry, has 600,000 transistors and is a 32-bit digital signal processor clocked at 26.6 MHz. It's able to produce CD quality sound with full stereo capability and wavetable synthesis. The processor can also perform complex mathematical functions. A Motorola 68000 clocked at 13.295 MHz provides general purpose ability. A 64-bit memory bus can transport a whopping 106.4 megabytes per second, and 16.8 million colours are available, allowing for 2D games which look staggering. Port-wise, the Jag has a 32-bit cartridge slot, an RF video output, and a video edge connector supporting both NTSC and PAL. There's also a digital signal processor port for serial communication, which can be connected to the Atari Lynx Comlinks port. 2 controller ports are provided, and the controllers are apparently the same as designed for the Panther, and are hefty beasts, sporting 12 selection buttons on the lower half, which can be embezzled with a slot-in card bespoke to each game, and a fairly standard 3+2+ D-pad layout at the top. Many people find these controllers cumbersome, large and uncomfortable, but I actually really like them. I haven't got particularly big hands, but it seems to fit perfectly, and the selection buttons just speak to my always conscious craving for keyboard style variety built into a console. IBM would manufacture the hardware and custom chip designs under a $500 million deal, with Atari wanting to retain the image of a homegrown American system, despite its somewhat English roots. In many ways, the Jaguar is actually pretty similar to the unreleased Panther in both its custom chip abilities and the use of a Motorola 68000 control processor. In fact, even the Jaguar's pack-in game, Cybermorph, is supposedly a port from the Panther hardware it was originally developed for, and may explain its somewhat lackluster draw distance. Being involved in early development titles, Jeff Minter of Tempest 2000 fame has also confirmed this, and cites that even with the huge sprite allowance, putting too many on a single scan line would require too much processing time and cause a tear across the affected row, and this is also the case on the Jaguar. However, the technical differences were enough for Atari to negate their Mega Drive and Super Nintendo rival for something considerably more hardcore. The problem was, that hardcore still took another 2 years. Atari's computer development would arrive first, with the Atari Falcon arriving in 1992, but unfortunately also the year Windows 3.1 would arrive and begin changing the IBM-compatible landscape. It was also the same year Sega launched their Sega CD, allowing a reasonable expansion on the Genesis hardware.
What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one?
By September 1993, Atari's old rival Commodore had released their console entry in the guise of the Amiga CD32, packing an AGA chipset, 32 bits and a CD-ROM drive. It was headed in the right direction. Only a month later, the 3DO company would launch the 3DO, surprisingly, based on a 32-bit RISC CPU and offering impressive FMV and 3D capabilities. The specifications, which originally made the Jaguar look impressive, were still impressive, but the market had began watering down.
Man, this blows.
The Jaguar would be the last in this wave of super consoles to arrive, unveiled at the August 1993 Chicago Entertainment Show, and with a test North American launch in New York and San Francisco in November 1993.
Get ready to discover the next generation of video games. Everything else is history.
However, it had a few advantages. Firstly, it was cheaper. Even launching for $50 more than Atari's quoted price of $200, it was still some $100 less than the European-focused CD32, and almost a third of the price of a 3DO. Atari hadn't been able to use their power without the price slogan for the Lynx, but the Jaguar was back on familiar ground. Second, the Jaguar had seemingly leapt an entire generation. Whilst the competition were churning out 16 and 32-bit consoles, here was a machine claiming to offer a whopping 64 bits of bus space. Could it be true?
Sega Genesis is 16 bits, 3DO is 32 bits, the Atari Jaguar is 64 bits, so is 64 bits and 3D graphics that you can only get with Jaguar. Which is more advanced? Clifford! Jaguar!
The initial advertising claimed so, boldly stamping the tagline, "Do the math," and magazine screenshots looked impressive. But in the flesh, the Cybermorph pack-in game didn't quite look as impressive as 64 bits should. Did it?
Programmers to produce effects like this. This game is called Cybermorph, and you can see the way the spaceship changes shape as it flies. Objects on the screen can be stretched, squashed, and warped at will.
People were playing Star Fox or Starwing by now on 16-bit systems, and most people who used a somewhat simplistic and impaired notion of bits to derive hardware ability expected a game that looked 4 times as good. Makes sense, right? Cybermorph looked pretty good, but not 4 times as good. We'll come back to that in a minute. Atari were hoping that the initial wow factor would ride their system straight into the homes of gamers, but had shipped only 17,000 units in their initial test market. Not bad, but fewer than they were hoping for. Still, press reaction was fairly positive, possibly with everyone still whipped into a blinding 64-bit frenzy, and Atari had promised some impressive add-ons. These included a CD-ROM based expansion, dial-up internet link for online gaming, an MPEG-2 video card, and even a virtual reality headset. Riding on the early 90s wave of virtual reality arcade machines and Nintendo's Virtual Boy. Yeah. By early 1994, the system was rolled out through North America, with Europe following in mid-1994, and even Korea and Japan witnessing their own launch, where only a meagre 5,000 were sold. And even though the system-worthy games had started to surface, in part due to Jeff Minter having a head start on the Panther system, software was still lacking. And it's not even worth me repeating how essential software is to a machine's success. We've all witnessed it countless times. Cybermorph was the standard pack-in game, and although it showed that the system could do 3D, it was lacking in playability, mostly as the landscape was drawn literally a few meters in front of you, leading to that all too familiar phrase,
Where did you learn to fly?
Not in dense fog, apparently.
Only one more.
The reason for this was mainly due to Atari rushing through the Jaguar's design. Although the system had launched some 2 years after the Panther was supposedly ready, Sam Trammell and the Atari executives still hassled Flair like crazy to get the custom hardware finalised for 1991 so that the product testing could be carried out during 1992. This resulted in 3 factors which severely limited the Jaguar's impact. The first was buggy and somewhat crippled hardware. The custom chip design wasn't quite complete and was 1 register short of being a much smoother experience. It was massively powerful as a 2D system and pretty good for 3D, but having an additional address register on the visual processor along with a slightly increased cache would have allowed the hardware to easily rival the next generation consoles such as the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Second was the poorly written development documentation. It's commonly known that the custom dual processor setup of a Jaguar was difficult to code for, deterring many developers. But yet the Sega Saturn had a similar, if not more complicated design. The main snag was that developers were for the most part coding blind. Game designers sought help from Atari for months, but due to drastic understaffing, it mostly fell on deaf or no ears. In conjunction with this, and the third point, is the development tools. Like the documentation, they were unfinished, buggy, and pretty unhelpful. Contrast this to the Sony PlayStation, who provided the best tools they could for game developers, and you can see where the difference is. Atari had promised a swathe of 200 developers already on board and producing titles, but these 3 problems alone meant a lot of developers just dropped out. The ones which remained mostly stuck with what they knew, and rather than utilising the powerful custom chips, just stuck with the machine's Motorola 68000 processor. Rather than game upon game of brilliant graphics and sound, we mostly witnessed a wave of games which looked almost identical to their 16-bit counterparts. And the reason is, they were. It was far easier just to port something from the Amiga or Mega Drive written around the 68000 chip than pour hours and hours of work into creating something bespoke and with reams and reams of custom assembly language. But these weren't the only problems. Not only did Atari not have the resources to produce many of their own internal games, but they set third-party licensing costs so high that it hardly seemed worth it. Combined with the hard reputation Jack Tramiel had built up towards developers and dealers in the years prior, this wasn't adding up to be a pretty picture. For all the advantages the Jaguar had, Atari were seemingly doing their best to negate them. And if it couldn't get any worse, all those bits started to become somewhat of a sticking point rather than a selling point. Publications and television programs, especially over in the United States, started questioning whether the system was really 64 bits at all, like it was the be-all and end-all of technology. You see, the Jaguar is built around two custom 32-bit chips, Tom, the GPU, and Jerry, the digital signal processor. Both of these sit around the 16-bit Motorola 68000, which can in effect be bypassed altogether or just left in charge of the controller inputs. But because the 64 bits of the Jaguar were made up of 32 bits of Tom and 32 bits of Jerry, many argued it wasn't really 64 bits.
Strictly speaking, the Jaguar is two 32-bit machines, one dedicated to sound, one to pictures, and it has special custom chips that help the whole lot move even faster. They're nicknamed Tom and Jerry. It's these two here. Jerry is dedicated to producing high-quality stereo sound, and Tom to moving graphics that allow the programmers to produce effects like this.
And this wasn't helped by the developers just using the 16-bit 68000 for processing.
So how do you like programming on the Jaguar?
Jaguar's really cool to program on. It's a lot of fun, definitely. It's a little tricky. There's not too much. A lot of people talk about the Jaguar's learning curve, and I don't know, I don't buy that. But it does. You have to definitely get used to programming multiple processors. But beyond that, it's really cool.
Despite the fact that the Jaguar still had a blisteringly fast 64-bit memory bus connecting these chips, including the Blitter and Object Processor, the claim and lack of gaming evidence still helped to infuse a bad, even though potentially unjustified reputation regarding the hardware. However, in October 1994, a game which had long been promised but suffered a few delays would emerge and help rectify that view just a little bit.
Introducing Alien vs. Predator for the 64-bit Atari Jaguar. You might not want to play it alone.
Ah! Mom.
Alien vs. Predator had been slapped in magazines and on TV shows for what seemed like years, and although planned as an early launch title, it was still a treat to behold when it arrived. The game was originally conceived as a Lynx title, but was switched as Atari began to place all their eggs into the Jaguar basket. Never put eggs in a Jaguar-shaped basket, kids, they'll just get eaten. Developed by Rebellion and working closely with Atari, the latter development of the Jaguar hardware and game were very intertwined.
What on earth got a hold of this guy?
With some hardware tweaks made as a result of the game requirements. With various concessions granted by Sam Tramiel, including double cartridge capacity to 4 MB and a later release date, the game turned out to be one of the essential purchases for the system.
Engaged.
And was almost universally praised in reviews for its tense atmosphere and foreboding game experience.
This is an amazing game. It's so good, it's worth buying a Jaguar for.
It's lovely and gory. Fans of the films will love this.
Apart from the odd magazine, which just really didn't get it.
I couldn't really be bothered with all the tactical play. One thing I'm gutted about was the Lynx was originally intended to be pairable to the Jaguar via the ComLynx port, allowing it to act as a motion scanner for the game. However, dwindling budgets just didn't allow for this scope of integration. It would have been so
damn cool though. For me personally, seeing this game in action was like a revelation. It was my two favourite films combined into something playable and mind-blowing. Talking about Doom, that was actually released the following month, and actually developed by id Software and John Carmack himself.
This is how it looks on the Jaguar, described as a special edition. They reckon it's the best version ever made. It's certainly easier to play as it comes with this special joypad overlay that shows you where all your weapons are.
Harking back to those hardware constraints, he was quoted as saying, "If the Jaguar had dumped the 68,000 and offered dynamic cache on the RISC processors with some buffering on the blitter, it would have put up a fight with a PlayStation." John has also mentioned that it's one of his favourite Doom versions, and if you compare it to other iterations of the time, it's clear how advanced the Jaguar hardware really is, despite its flaws. It's also the only console version without music, as the DSP chip was required for maths processing, and this adds a somewhat atmospheric slant to the game, almost reminiscent of Alien vs Predator. (1994) also witnessed the announcement of the Jaguar Voice and Data Communicator, known as the JVM. This allowed direct dial-up play between console owners, although only about 100 units were actually made, and only one game, Ultra Vortex, supports the modem by entering 911 on the keypad at game startup. Other games were released in the Christmas run-up, some good, bad.
Any new console needs some really good games to make it a success. Unfortunately for the Jaguar, Club Drive is not going to do the trick.
It's an original idea for a game, but it doesn't work because the graphics are so poor.
This is a waste of plastic. The gameplay is pathetic and it looks terrible.
Christmas 1994 would mark the first real Christmas period for the Jaguar, and although take-up was somewhat stilted in the US of A, over in Europe and especially the UK, demand was strong. In fact, as with so many other systems we've covered, demand was outstripping supply. But the tiny, 12-strong Atari team over in this region had a tough time from the beginning. The Jaguar hit the ground running in mid-1994, and soon began outselling the much more expensive 3DO, despite the European division having next to no marketing budget. Most press coverage was done through interviews and reviews rather than paid advertising, but this still created considerable demand, with the Atari brand seen as much stronger over here, riding on the success of the ST. However, despite being promised 250,000 units for the Christmas period, only 25,000 were delivered in early December, with another 25,000 just days before Christmas.
This time on the shoot-'em-up Alien vs Predator. Kill, 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 kill.
People wanted the machines, Atari just couldn't ship them. It was a very similar state of affairs for the Amiga CD32 the previous year, which by now had already been discontinued in April 1994. After the demise of Commodore.
It's been difficult to get hold of a Jaguar. The company who make it, Atari, were running out of money, so they couldn't afford to advertise it properly or manufacture enough to meet demand. Consequently, gameplay companies were reluctant to develop software for it.
But last week, some good news, a massive vote of confidence from video games giant Sega. They decided to invest in Atari, which means there should be loads of games for it, including Sega hits like Virtua Racing.
Atari just didn't have the resources to support their system successfully, and even a $140 million investment from Sega, part of which settled previous legal disputes as well as opening up game patents for Sega's use, didn't help much either. If there was one final chance for Atari, it had probably just blown it.
There's some interesting hardware in the shops this Christmas. There's the 3DO, the first CD super console. Then there's a CDI, which lets you play movies on CD and has some nice looking games like this new one, Chaos Control. Then we've got the Neo Geo CD, which lets you play arcade fighting games in your home. And then there's the Jaguar, the world's first 64-bit console. But 3 new machines are set to take over next year.
This one is Sega's Saturn.
This one's the Sony PlayStation, and this one's also just been released in Japan.
And so to Nintendo's Super Console, the Ultra 64. Well, details about it are rather sketchy.
As 1995 came around and after selling 100,000 units, the Jaguar would be dropped in price to $149 in the US and a Pro controller was released, offering all sorts of additional buttons to press your way around, some of which would prove useful for the trickle of games still emerging. Again, the usual mix of lazy ports, occasional gem, and fair share of bad. Nothing really groundbreaking, although Missile Command 3D was a pretty good action package, especially used in conjunction with the virtual reality headset. Wait a minute. What happened to that promised VR system? I remember seeing it advertised in ST format and thinking, blow me, this is going to be freaking amazing. But yet it still wasn't here. Maybe it'll arrive later in 1995. Let's wait and see. You see, things were pretty dire for Atari at this point. Remember the Atari Falcon? Yeah, that was discontinued way back in 1993, just a year after its launch. The ST was as dead as a dodo, and the Lynx was receiving the axe right about now. Atari really did put all their faith in the Jaguar. They had to. A combination of poor past decisions, bad timing and just better competition everywhere had crippled the once cutting-edge company. Sam Trammell would do an interview in mid-1995 for Next Generation magazine where he claimed that the Atari Jaguar was leaps ahead of the Saturn and equally as powerful as the PlayStation. He also claimed that the backwards compatible Jaguar 2 was in production, and that they were likely to sue Sony for attempting to subsidise the cost of a PlayStation via Japanese sales and dumping it in the US at a reduced cost. None of these statements would come to fruition, although some Jaguar 2 prototypes are known to exist and do work with existing Jaguar titles. The same magazine would also review the Jaguar later in 1995, commenting that, thus far, Atari has spectacularly failed to deliver on the software side, leaving many to question the actual quality and capability of the hardware, with only one or two exceptions. There have just been no truly great games for the Jaguar up to now. They also noted that the company had much less brand recognition than Sega, Sony, Nintendo, and even 3DO, giving the system 2 out of 5 stars, and commenting that if the price was dropped further and more software made available, then it could still compete. Yeah, both of which are easier said than done, of course. Still, this was from the same publisher who said that Alien vs Predator was crap.
All the big names have brought out new chunky hardware. This was the first hit at the shops in this country, the Sega Saturn. It's been out since the 8th of July.
The next super console to be released in the UK is this one. This is the Sony PlayStation and it's out this month.
Sega would release the Saturn in the summer of 1995, followed by Sony's PlayStation in autumn. And although the Jaguar had raw computational power but could actually beat these machines with its RISC processors, the PlayStation had 3D acceleration built in from the go, and both the Sega and Sony machines had bigger budgets and better development resources. We all know the story from this point out. It also marked the point where many kids realised that bits don't really mean too much as a standalone measurement of power. During this year, Atari Corporation's sales more than halved, from $38.7 million in 1994 to $14.6 million in 1995, and only 25,000 Jaguars would be sold, representing 76% of this income figure. It would be easy to blame it on Sam Trammell pushing the Atari Jaguar out too early, or refusing to launch the Panther, but really, what could that have achieved? The Panther would likely have failed against the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, and delaying the Jaguar even further would have just pushed it more and more into PlayStation and Sega Saturn territory. If you ask me, Atari were facing a losing battle which they tried hard to fight, but placing all their bets on the Jaguar just didn't work out. Despite the optimism, all this weighed on Sam Trammell, and he would suffer a heart attack before the year was out. Thankfully, he didn't die, but it led to Jack returning to oversee operations. Still, 1995 did have a few promising notes. One of the promised accessories, the Atari Jaguar CD, was actually released on the 21st of September 1995. The unit offered a double-speed drive and allowed Jaguar games with potentially huge scope to come to fruition. The device also has a cartridge slot at the rear, allowing cartridge games to be passed through and for the CD unit to remain in place, and this also allowed cartridge games to run in tandem with accompanying CD-ROMs, although no such software was actually ever made. What was made was the memory track cartridge for saving game data and high scores.
Objective found.
The hardware also has a built-in virtual light machine written by Jeff Minter himself that allowed changing on-screen graphics through a spectrum analyzer, much like Windows Media Player would grace us with some 8 years later.
I'll do a good job whenever I can. Well, we're going to take a look at some of the stuff Jeff has done. And my favorite soft of the entire show, believe it or not, is not a game, but it's actually the VLM, Virtual Light Machine. We've been hearing a lot about it. This is actually it. And let me tell you, it's just fascinating.
It's also worth noting that Jaguar CDs can hold 790 megabytes of data, much more than standard CD-ROMs, but also allowing for much less error correction, leading to problems with units, especially ones which have survived into modern times. Another surprise at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, 2 products were unveiled. The first was, oh yes, the virtual reality headset. The device was planned for pre-Christmas release, but never made it, unfortunately, because it could have actually changed things around for the Jaguar. There are, however, 2 prototypes in existence which are showcased at retro gaming events, and apparently they work pretty well with Missile Command 3D.
In terms of the tracking system, we have probably the world's highest performing tracking system, even though it's a consumer unit. This unit actually performs to a higher specification than even the industrial systems that we use in our high-performance arcade systems.
Atari would also unveil the Jaguar Duo. This wasn't a Jaguar 2, just a bathroom scale resembling piece of kit which combined the Jaguar and CD unit into one device, much like the Sega Multi-Mega or CDX, and we know just how successful they were. The Duo would also never make it to market. In fact, when Jack took the reins, the Jaguar's planned accessories and spin-offs were quickly killed off, followed by a swathe of staff redundancies. Atari Interactive, which had been set up to port games to MS-DOS, was also closed, and by January 1996, he was looking to sell the company off, having decided it really was time to get out of the industry this time. The rather strange demise for Atari would come in a reverse merger with hard drive manufacturer JTS Storage. The new company, JTS Corporation, would take Jack and some Atari executives on as board members, with the promise to shareholders that Atari would continue operations after the deal was complete. However, by 1997, Atari was just a single person and a desk, John Scrooge. John handled the final Jaguar support and licensing before the remainder of the company was sold to Hasbro on the 28th of February 1998, and finally onto Infogrames, where it now operates under the name of Atari SA. As for the Jaguar, well, official games continued to be produced up until about 2000, and in fact into 2000 and beyond, and this is in fact thanks to Hasbro. Rather than stuffing away the rights of old inventions in a dark cupboard and leaving them to fester, Hasbro actually released all the console's rights, opening up the platform for anyone to publish on. To add a layer of extra icing, Kurt Vendel of Atari Museum then happened to locate the encryption keys for both cartridge and CD formats, allowing anyone to develop games on unmodified machines. Of course, developing on cartridges is harder and more expensive, so the CD add-ons are in high demand, but software on both formats has been made available in recent years, and some of it is truly sensational. In the UK, Telegames also sells remakes of Atari Jaguar games, and for a while consoles were apparently available through game stores. They're not in game anymore, but apparently still available online for £150 brand new. It seems that some 20 years after the Jaguar looked to storm the world with the same number 64 that helped Jack Tramiel dominate with the Commodore 64, Developers and committed community members are finally unlocking the potential of those custom components and producing some mind-blowing games. Maybe that comment Sam made about the Jaguar being as powerful as the PlayStation wasn't as throwaway as it sounded. His words seem to feel increasingly true as more and more secrets of this frankly impressive machine are unlocked. Oh, one last thing. The mould for the Jaguar case was bought by Imaging Systems, a dental imaging equipment manufacturer, and they used the cases to hold their hot rod camera, with cartridge moulds used to create optional memory expansions. So if you ever see one on your dentist's wall, don't presume they're getting a bit of Jaguar action in between appointments. These moulds were then purchased by Mike Kennedy to house the retro video game system, otherwise known as the Coleco Chameleon. The console that just ended up being a Super Nintendo Mini and then some sort of expansion card in a case. And that's not really a fitting end for this shell, so let's hope it goes on to become something more substantial and worthy of its original incarnation. Because frankly,
I love it!
Thank you for watching this video on the Atari Jaguar. There's some more videos there you can click, or you can subscribe or give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or even contribute to my Patreon to keep the channel going, and there's some rewards you can collect for doing that. In any case, thank you for watching this video, and as always, I hope you have a tremendous evening.